Welcome, Geoff Lockwood, to Strauss and Company. We've got an online exhibition in September that has a significant collection of bird art on the auction, and it's an array of South African and overseas illustrators. And Geoff's here to just share some of his insights about what it means to be a bird artist and what the process involves. Hi there, Geoff. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's always lovely to hear about people who are an expert in a field and can add to our knowledge of that. So you're here because you're a bird artist, you're an ornithologist, you're an educator, you're a conservationist. And how did that happen? You obviously had a passion for birds as a kid, but where did you get to the point where you were then illustrating birds for the Roberts Birds of Southern Africa?
Okay, so it started fortunately with a father who was quite keen on the outdoors. So we did a lot of camping and trips like that. And I got bitten by the bird bug quite early. I was nuts about all things wildlife, but stuck in Joburg for most of the year, you kind of gravitated to what at least was available. And the whole thing probably started moving in the direction of illustrations when I went on a school trip to the Kruger Park.
Oh yes, in primary school.
In primary school, and we had a very intense and very dedicated headmaster called Coldry, Mr. Coldry, and Mr. Coldry insisted that we compile a report on the trip afterwards. And I then started actually copying pictures out of Roberts, as it turned out, and trying to paint them in this report. And that's basically where it got started. And then probably the next real impetus came when I'd just come out of the army after doing national service. And in the time I was away, Simon Calburn had actually moved in across the road. And I can remember looking at that stage, he had a book, and I looked at it and I kind of thought, some interesting stuff, not really impressed with some stuff, really arrogant, but didn't even say hi to him until one day I found a kingfisher nesting on the Bromfontein Spruit. And I kind of literally rushed over, knocked on his door, said, "Hi, I'm Geoff, do you want to come and see this kingfisher?" And that really was the kind of big push, because Simon introduced me to the people at the Transvaal Museum, which gave me access to their study material, their reference skins. And he was not so much a mentor as somebody who just effectively facilitated a lot of contacts, which actually then gave me a new direction. And just after the army, I probably needed a new direction.
Absolutely. And so did you have any formal art tuition at all?
None at all. None at all, apart from basic art at school, didn't take art through into matric even. And it really was a kind of bit of an experimentation. If I'd had basic design, for example, I can remember a sequence where I kept trying to actually get one painting to work, and I'd step away from it and it looked wrong because of the way I'd extended the perch of the bird. It was stopping short of the bottom, and it was pushing that back, but the bird was in front of the plant behind it. And basic design 101, kind of thing that you would have learnt in first couple of weeks of art school. And I just agonized over this and made the same mistake a couple of times before the penny dropped. So yeah, it was certainly not the easy way or the quick way, but in some ways I don't know if I would have had the interest or the patience to put up with stuff that wasn't immediately relevant to what I wanted to do.
Absolutely. And what sort of media do you use? Most bird artists seem to do watercolor on paper, or
I was using at that stage gouache. There were a couple of issues with particularly some of the more vivid purples and things, because no one makes permanent gouaches in those colors. So you kind of eventually start incorporating all sorts of things like acrylics and inks and what will ever give you the color. And that's on illustration board basically, because I got very tired of stretching paper.
Yes, and it still cockles and everything if the weather goes funny. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And obviously your own experience of watching birds in the bush is your primary source of information about the birds and their postures and their habitats. What other kind of research do you have to do when you're doing something like a book? You've contributed to illustrations to Roberts. How do you actually go about doing the necessary research for birds that you might not be very familiar with?
Okay, that can have real issues, and in fact, some of the early illustrations I did on the Roberts project illustrate the problem. The birds that go well are generally birds you know fairly well already, so your drafting is already up to speed and giving you something that you can work with. And then you typically, at least in my case, you would use something called a museum skin or a museum reference skin. So you go through, collect a study skin of this.
It's basically a dead bird in the museum.
It's a skin.
It's not like a taxidermy.
It's not taxidermied at all. It's preserved. There's no effort to generate any kind of lifelike posture. It's the eye. There's no eyes. You know, it literally is lying on its back flat in a tray, along with hundreds of others of the same species. But what was interesting and what very clearly brought home the issues that you can have when you ask to illustrate things you don't know well. And all you're working off now is a study skin.
Not a live specimen.
I had this picture which from a feather point of view looked fine. And I can remember taking it through to the Transvaal Museum and bumping into Alan Kemp, and who was very kindly critiquing the stuff as I was doing it. And there was a guy, Peter Les Milstein, who was visiting. And he took one look at this. He said, "You haven't seen this bird, have you?"
Oh dear.
And I said, "No, but how do you know?" He said, "You've painted it like a little flycatcher, sleek and, you know, good to go. This thing, when it's sitting on a branch, is like a blob." And when I finally saw my first African broadbill, that's exactly the kind of impression it gave, this blob on a branch. So, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. So it must be quite a time-consuming process trying to do all that, and it must take years to really get all the drawings together and the illustrations. I've got an example of your own book here, which is the garden birds, and this obviously doesn't have as many illustrations as Roberts does, but it's still got a significant number of illustrations.
Yeah.
And it must take years.
It takes a while. You know, for me, quite often the biggest problem was actually getting the plate to fill, you know, all the drawings put in place, scaled.
Do you do them all as a single illustration?
You would do that on one single plate, yeah.
Well, it might be 5 or 6 birds.
And you hope like crazy you don't do anything crazy and mess it up, yeah, because then it's back to square one. And yeah, and then, you know, the kind of references, some birds are fairly easy. The classic horror stories, the LBJs, you have to spend a lot of time, because there the subtle detail is so much more important in carrying over the character and the identity of the bird you're illustrating. So
yes, exactly, and there's enough bird experts around the world who immediately notice if you've got something slightly wrong.
Absolutely.
You've got a very informed audience who are the people looking at your work. Because like botanical art, bird art is very scientific, and obviously you've got to get a very naturalistic, authentic image of the bird. How much scope is there still for your own personal style and your own personal expression in an artwork that you're doing, especially for publication?
I always was drawn more to the very sort of strict illustrative thing, rather than a slightly more abstract style. Somebody like Lee Voigt, for me, managed with half the work that I put in to capture the soul of I can remember one painting she did of a martial eagle, which was probably 70% absent, if I can put it that way. So she just with those critical feathers, you know, the crest and the eye and stuff like that, had created a picture that really, as I said, I can remember that, and that must be 30, 40 years later kind of thing. And so I was quite envious of that ability to actually literally pare things down but keep the critical stuff. And for pure illustration, obviously a lot of fairly intense technical things. You need to understand the topography of a bird, you need to understand the actual way its body parts work so that your drafting can look lifelike. And it's, as I said, the better you know the bird, the better that painting will work.
And it's still recognisably your own. Even
Yes.
though it's
Yeah.
doing all that in a very naturalistic, realistic way, you would still be able to pick out most of the bird
Most of the artists
you know,
have their own thumbprint, which is very distinctive. Graham Arnott, for example, the way he creates a picture is so typical that you could almost literally walk in and from across the room say, okay, there's Graham's section, kind of. So those are the nice ones. Those ones who have a distinctive stamp. And then I've been lucky enough through the years and through my involvement with birds generally to have interacted with a lot of the people that you have on sale. So it was kind of fun to just sort of breeze through the thumbnails and think, okay, I haven't heard of her, from her or of her for a while, and I wonder what he's doing, and obviously.
Yes. We've got Johan Hoekstra, Dick Finley,
yeah.
Kenneth Newman,
Yeah.
so certainly some of the major names.
Absolutely.
Penny Meakin over there with the pencil illustrations in the background. Now, before we sat down, you mentioned that bird over there is your bird, the owl at the end. So just tell us a little bit about why that's your bird.
Okay, so spotted eagle owls generally for me have been one of those families that has always had special appeal. But spotted eagle owls, I've been lucky enough over nearly 50 years now to have worked very closely with these birds. And where I live at Delta Environmental Centre, I currently have a family with three chicks that are probably a week and a half to 2 weeks off fledging. And they literally are 3 meters from where I normally sit and work. So I can sometimes hear the conversations going on at the nest box just outside my study. And I can also, unfortunately, sometimes hear the crows that have been giving them hell for the last couple of years. So I leap up and out the window and go running across the roof, brandishing a stick, chasing crows. So yeah, it's just, when you work that intimately with a species.
You're literally living with them.
And you literally are living with them. And I can remember last year when we were in hard lockdown, I'd left something out on the roof and it was getting dark and there was a possibility of rain. So I leapt out the window, went charging across the roof, and I nearly stepped on the female. And it was kind of like I hadn't even thought about her being out on the roof. And she must just looked at me, I wonder what he's up to, kind of thing. And I kind of, like 2.5 meters away from her, I sort of realized she was there, and I then sort of backed up and slowly chatted to her quietly and, okay, sorry, And those kind of encounters, those kind of relationships, because it has become a relationship. I mean, I think now when the crows are being difficult, they sit there waiting, where is he? Why is he not chasing them away, kind of thing.
Have you got a catty so that you
I have a catty.
Perfect.
So it's just one of those real joys to have that kind of close contact with something. And what I've been doing is posting the story of this year's season on Facebook and on the BirdLife Facebook group and some of the local bird club Facebook pages and so on, because I just have been so blown away with what's happening and the joy of being able to watch, in this case, a brand new male, literally fresh off the press, actually literally finding his feet and growing into this role of mate first and now provider, because man, that poor guy has got to feed himself, his mate, and 3 chicks at the moment.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was photography. Obviously there's fantastic photography, there's fantastic videography, and yet bird art still has its place. What is the reason for that?
I think it's interesting that even with the incredible improvement in photography, I mean, digital has just changed the game. If you were a wildlife photographer, in the good old film days, you effectively had a fairly good living if you were good at your trade. Nowadays, I mean, somebody with a relatively inexpensive camera and lens can go out and get unbelievable stuff. So it's made it very much harder for the so-called pros. But one of the limits of photography when it comes to particularly illustrating birds in a field guide, for example, is getting just the right view of a bird. You might get a brilliant picture, but it doesn't show a particular key feature. You know, so you now need another picture to actually show the other side or whatever. And where artists have an advantage over that, even now, is the ability to actually not create a pose, but reflect a pose which actually shows those key identification features. And it may not last forever. I mean, if there are enough people with enough cameras out there, those kind of poses are going to be recorded digitally eventually anyway. But at the moment, there's still a call for those groups of species. I mean, you know, kind of pallid swift and mottled swifts and things like that. But you can't get close. You can't, you know, you've got to climb halfway up in Nyanga and then hope they fly over. So yeah, it's a fun thing, and it is an artifact. But it's interesting that the top-selling field guides, even now in this country, and we have some incredible field guides. Probably for a region, we have some of the best field guides of anywhere. But they're still using artists to illustrate them. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the broader art world, of course, people still value the craftsmanship and the expertise and everything that goes into, you know, a very meticulous illustration.
Absolutely.
So that will never go away.
Absolutely. Hopefully it won't go away.
Hopefully not. Because, I mean, these days they don't even teach technique at art schools.
Yeah.
So I think those artists who do exhibit, you know, high skills level, there's always, you know, a level of fascination with that that will always entrance people. There was a whole generation of art illustrators doing bird art. Many like Ken Newman have now passed away.
Yeah.
What is happening in a younger generation? Are youngsters doing this kind of art? Are they interested in birds from a wildlife point of view as well as an art point of view? Is climate change having an effect on what people do, and habitat loss? How does that all play into what's happening now?
I think at one level, the youngsters we're seeing coming through into birding are making us kind of former generation crowd look positively poor. The skill sets, the knowledge levels, and that in part is because of the improvement in the resources they've had, you know, starting out in the hobby. But when it comes to actual young artists, it's actually kind of sad in a way that I think for many of them, life seems to have just accelerated to the point where that kind of long, you know, kind of time on your own, agonizing over your latest masterpiece, there doesn't seem to be as much taste for that. But I think equally, I think a lot of people can capture birds now relatively inexpensively on film or on digital media. And that now is actually, you know, much easier for people. So if you want to share the glory of a strange bird that happens to have got lost and ended up in South Africa, you know, you're not going to go home and sit down and do a little painting of it and actually, you know, sort of put that out there. And so I think in that sense, photography may actually have cut down the number of people drawn into bird illustration. But, you know, that I might be wrong. That's just a sense I get from looking around and seeing who's doing it.
Well, in botanical art, it seems there are lots of young artists, not only in South Africa, but internationally. But oddly enough, botanical art seems to be much more of a female occupation, or women seem to be more women artists, whereas in bird art, it's mostly dominated by men. Certainly has been in the past. It's interesting that there's a slight gender division, because you think that it would be, once you're out there bird watching, you think it wouldn't really make a difference, but somehow that seems to have been a trend.
It's interesting because as I've grown older, my interests have broadened. And I can remember the worst thing for me doing a major painting as opposed to an illustration with just a suggested background. A major painting was the wasted time spent on the background. I mean, it became so when you started work on the bird, the picture was now taking shape. And what's happened is I've become a lot more interested in plants. I wouldn't say I'm a botanist by any means. And I've also now, through extensive work in the field, become very, very keen and very good at finding ground orchids.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And so, that's that. But I've never been drawn to the idea of trying to paint an orchid. I love them. I find them intriguing. We've found some awesome stuff. We've got a share in a farm near Belfast where we found over 30 species of orchid. And so that's kind of another interest, another joy. But it's interesting that I've never thought to try and paint.
It is strange. It's obviously a particular passion for the birds, and that's what drives you, because it's a hugely time-consuming production to put together any kind of illustration of a bird, but especially if it's got a whole background and everything to go with it. I'm sure some illustrations must take months.
Yeah, they do. And I used to find that, particularly if I was busy with other stuff, I would really, really battle if I had to park things for a long period. Particularly if I hadn't got to the bird yet.
Yes.
If the bird was already taking shape, I could then possibly go back and restart, But if I had to put something aside for other work for maybe a week or so, I'd suddenly have a problem, because in the, walking past, you'd have a look and you'd be querying what was going on. And by the time you were ready to start again, you'd now rethought the original concept, had a look at the drafting and thought, no, that you can do
better some other way.
So rip that one off, start again. And by the third time that happened, I was finding I was going crazy. I just lost all joy or pleasure in the project. So it's an interesting challenge. It always will be. And as you say, there are an awful lot of people who these days know a lot more about birds and are therefore in a much better place to critique your take on a species as well. So it's
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and I'm hoping we have a lot of interest in this session that we're having on our sale, because we don't get bird art very often.
No.
It doesn't come onto the secondary market a lot. In fact, you don't see it even in gallery exhibitions very much. So I think that it's going to be really interesting, and to have such a broad array of artists on the sale. Unfortunately, none of yours.
No, I didn't work on that.
Yes, you better get going.
Yeah, I actually promised myself that when I retired, I'd go back to art, and I got as far as starting to accumulate sable hair brushes and things like that, and while I still had the money. And it just hasn't happened. In fact, for some reason, I seem to be busier now than I've ever been.
Yes, I don't think we're ever going to retire. Life's not like that anymore.
No.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Geoff. That's really fantastic to have heard all your lovely anecdotes and to get an insight into exactly what the process is about and just how differently people approach it as well. It's really interesting. And thank you so much. And good luck with all your baby owls and all your other endeavours.
Thank you very much, Hazel. It's been great fun. And thank you for allowing me to take a wander down memory lane and actually touch at least some kind of base with some of the people who actually played such a role in my career and development. Thank you.
Yes, marvellous. Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks.